It's currently fashionable to claim that renewables are cheap, and if only we could get rid of all that pesky gas generation, our electricity bills will fall. This video will explain why that is total nonsense. The cheap renewables claim rests on them having low marginal costs, so they can always outbid gas-fired generations in what's called the merit order, and gas sets the wholesale price most of the time. This is an example from a prominent Substack. But this ignores the full cost of renewables, which in reality can cost 2 or 3 times more than gas in our bills. See this revised chart. So, how do I arrive at this conclusion? Currently, the wholesale price of electricity set by gas is around £75 per megawatt hour. Of this, about £60 is the fuel cost, and about £15 is a carbon tax levied through the emissions trading scheme. So how does this compare to the basic cost of renewables? If we start with offshore wind, which is funded by two different subsidy schemes, the first is Contracts for Difference, or CFDs, and the second is Renewables Obligation Certificates, or ROCs. Currently, active CFDs for offshore wind cost about £158 per megawatt hour, or more than double the cost of gas-fired electricity. CFD generators agree an index-linked fixed price for their power. They receive the market price for their output and then get a top-up subsidy from our electricity bills to the strike price. So currently they get paid on average about £83 per megawatt hour in subsidies, or more than half their revenue. You might have heard that sometimes the generators have to pay back to consumers if the market price is above the strike price. This is true, but since the scheme was conceived, we've paid over $10 billion in subsidies and received back only about $346 million during the energy crisis of 2022. Okay, let's go back to the cost of offshore wind. ROC-funded offshore wind gets paid the market price and also receives an average of about 1.9 ROCs per megawatt hour of electricity generated. In 2025-26, these are worth about £67 each. So ROC-funded offshore wind receives about £127 in subsidy on top of the market price. So the basic cost is about £203 per megawatt hour. Both CFDs and ROCs are index linked, so their prices go up each year with inflation. Onshore wind costs about £117 per megawatt hour for CFD funded units to around £140 per megawatt hour for ROC funded units. CFD funded solar costs about £77 per megawatt hour, and ROC funded solar about £164 per megawatt hour. Solar is also funded by what are called feed-in tariffs, which cost us on average about £221 per megawatt hour in 2023-24. There have been two inflationary increases since then, so the current cost will be much higher. Each year, there's an auction to allocate new renewables capacity. Last year's AR6 awarded contracts at £85 per megawatt hour in today's money to offshore wind. But the flagship project of that auction, Hornsea Project 4, has recently been cancelled because it wasn't economic for the developer. Realistically, the economic cost of offshore wind is higher than £85 per megawatt hour, so it's much more expensive than gas. Onshore wind was awarded contracts of about £73 per megawatt hour at 2025 prices, and solar got contracts at about £72 per megawatt hour. I can hear you asking, if your offshore wind and solar cost about the same as gas-fired electricity, why don't we build more of it? Well, wind and solar are both intermittent, which means that their output is dependent upon the seasons and the weather. Sometimes they can produce too much for the grid to handle, so we pay wind farms to turn off and then pay gas-fired generators to make up the difference. We pay for this variable and unreliable output through grid balancing and backup charges. If you attribute these costs to wind and solar, it adds about £32 per megawatt hour to their costs. This takes offshore wind to about £190 per megawatt hour for CFDs and £234 per megawatt hour for ROCs, or more than 3 times the cost of gas-fired electricity. The cost of onshore wind goes up to £148 for CFDs and £171 for ROC units. Solar goes up to between £108 for CFDs to a whopping £252 per megawatt hour for those funded by feed-in tariffs. New onshore wind and new solar are also much more expensive than gas-fired electricity when you take into account the grid balancing and backup. And we haven't even included the extra cost of the wires to connect all these remote wind and solar farms, which add even more to our bills. As you've seen, wind and solar are much more expensive than gas. Don't let the mainstream media or other commentators fool you into believing anything else.